Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. You know, I felt it was time to give the SNES a little love, so today I've got a new episode of Utterly Pointless Comparisons for you. And I'm going to take a look at the arcade and SNES versions of Mortal Kombat II. Here's a look at the specs of the arcade hardware versus the SNES, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. In June of 1993, Midway released Mortal Kombat II into the arcades. It was the follow-up to their hugely popular and bloody fighting game, Mortal Kombat, which featured digitized characters. Mortal Kombat II was an even bigger success than the first game in the series, featuring more characters, more fatalities and finishing moves, and more special moves, along with just about more of everything that made the first game a success. Mortal Kombat II showed a significant level of refinement over the popular but rough around the edges original Mortal Kombat. And even though I would say that while Mortal Kombat II is a really good game, it lacks the depth and replayability of the Street Fighter titles and doesn't hold up nearly as well as they do. But don't get me wrong, Mortal Kombat 2 is really good. Now when the first Mortal Kombat was brought to the Genesis and SNES, the Genesis version looked worse but played better and had all the blood from the arcade game, albeit requiring activation via a special code. The SNES game suffered tremendously in sales compared to the Genesis version, in large part because the violence was very toned down compared to the arcade original. I mean, the blood was replaced with sweat, and some fatalities were significantly modified. Aside from that, it suffered from very laggy controls and flat-out bad, understated sound. You might think the same mistakes would be repeated for the SNES version of Mortal Kombat 2. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
The release of Mortal Kombat 2 in 1994 on the SNES shows that lessons were learned, and Sculptured Software delivered a much more polished game that contained all the blood and fatalities from the arcade original. Overall, it's a well-done conversion, but it might not be quite as close as you remember if you haven't seen it in a while. So we'll check out the whole game in just a few seconds. As far as recording methodology goes for this one, I did use save states to ensure that we'd see the same characters fighting on the same backgrounds at all times, and did the same fatality in every match where a fatality was possible. The randomness of the difficulty and lots of cheapo AI made this one pretty frustrating to record, but I soldiered through it. Also, the SNES version has long pauses with black screens between every screen transition, meaning going from the character select screen to the mountain, or when going to the mountain to the first round, or when going from one round to the next. I shorten these a lot, so you won't waste literally minutes of your time just looking at a black screen today. I will show you what the pauses were like at the end of the video during my summary. Alright, let's get on with it. Alright, here we go. So we've got the arcade on the left, obviously, and the Super Nintendo on the right. As you can see, presentation is pretty similar from the get-go, and, you know, they've done a pretty good job at this. The resolution is obviously lower on the Super Nintendo, and the character sizes are a lot smaller. You may not remember, if you haven't seen this in a long time, just how much smaller the characters are. Now here for our first background, we can see it's pretty well recreated. But if you look at some details like on the platform, the bridge the characters are on, it's missing a lot of those lines and stuff that are in the arcade version. You don't see it segmented as much on the Super Nintendo. And there are some differences in the way the chains look also. And aside from some slight palette changes, otherwise this looks pretty well done. And here's our first fatality, Kitana's lovely kiss of death. So you see the Super Nintendo one happened first. Pretty graphic. On the arcade version, though, there's a much bigger explosion and way more body parts fly out. Alright, here we go to our second stage. And we're going to see quite a few changes in backgrounds as things go on here. I should also note that the Super Nintendo version is letterboxed slightly. That's why you see that black bar at the bottom of the screen. And also, some of the backgrounds are condensed a bit, like this one right here with the spikes on the top of the screen. Here you can see them, readily on the Super Nintendo. And for the dragons flying in the background, they're simplified a little on the Super Nintendo, and the background colors, there are pretty clear differences between them also. We have a more dithered appearance, on the SNES. Still, overall, I would rate this background as very well done. Here, I'm going to pause it so we can watch these fatalities happen at the same time this time. You'll notice there are slight timing differences still. The arcade version, your poor victim shakes around a little bit more before they finally explode. But then it finishes up with the win count and the fatality label a lot faster than the home version does. So next up, we've got Kung Lao here. So it's his first appearance in a Mortal Kombat game. For this background, we've got oddly dark colors on the SNES compared to the arcade version. And it's hard to make out a lot of the same details on SNES here. It still looks pretty good. I just wish they had lightened it up a little more to match the arcade version better. Now, one thing I also want to point out here is that when you look at the characters' faces, like Kitana here, there's almost no detail in the SNES version when you look at it close up. If you're looking at this on a phone or anything like that with a tiny screen, it might be hard to see. But if you're looking at this on a TV, just watch, especially, when she takes her mask off to do the fatality. There is almost no detail in the face on Super Nintendo, and there's quite a lot in the arcade version.
Fatality.
And then one thing that I haven't talked about here yet is sound. So the sound in the arcade version, is definitely better. No question about it. It's a little more impactful, it's louder, it's clearer, and the instruments just sound better. On the Super Nintendo, the sound quality, it's better than it was in the first Mortal Kombat port, but it's still not great. Now in this background, we actually have quite a bit to talk about. So first, the carpeting is a whole different color on the Super Nintendo. We lose quite a few background layers of scrolling here on the SNES. So in the arcade version, the columns in the background scroll at a different speed, and then behind that we have 2 cloud layers. On the Super Nintendo, the columns are just part of the background. There's only, 1 layer of the main background and then the clouds behind it. And we do have the little floating wizard-style guy. He bobs up and down in the arcade version, but on the Super Nintendo, he's just still. Now, that's one thing that happens to be missing from the Genesis version for some odd reason, so I just figured I'd point that out here. We have the clouds scrolling by on Genesis, but the little wizard guy is just not there. And I'll probably bring up the Genesis version here and there, but I won't talk about it too much. With Kitana, she's kind of like easy mode, especially if you're talking about the arcade game here, and the final bosses in the arcade game are a snap if you're playing as Kitana. Now, some of the regular fighters are really tough, especially as you get a little bit further into the game. Once you hit around the 3rd or 4th fighter, you'll start seeing some really weird, cheap AI that seems like it knows what you're thinking, and it is really frustrating to play this game at times. Alright, here we are in the woods facing Liu Kang. And this level at first glance seems pretty well done on the Super Nintendo version, and it is. But there are quite a few changes here that are not so obvious on first glance. First, there's a lot less detail in the bushes and stuff on the ground. Also, the Super Nintendo version only has 2 background layers on this part, while in the arcade version it actually has 5. So pretty big difference there. And for some of the trees in the background, if you look at the Super Nintendo one, like the ones that are further away, are very pixely, very low detail, just a whole bunch of blocks for the most part. While in the arcade version, they remain pretty detailed all the way up to the ones at the very back row. Now, one thing that is affected on the Super Nintendo version because of the character size seems to be the collision boxes. It seems a little bit harder to hit people with Kitana's, airborne fan-throwing move, like right after a jump kick or a jump punch. And a lot of that is because it seems like the characters are a much smaller target in general than they are in the arcade version. And while I haven't scientifically measured it, it seems to me that just through gameplay, that the timing on some of the moves feels off on the Super Nintendo version. Like, if you go too fast, it doesn't quite pick them up where it would in the arcade one. So this background, it's alright on Super Nintendo, but it's more heavily modified than probably any of the others. Now, it's not particularly great or super interesting in any version of the game, I feel, this sort of forge area. But I will note on Genesis, this one does look a little bit closer to the layout of the arcade game for where things are placed. I'll also point out here that the lava or magma or whatever that is, the animation of it is a little bit simpler in the Super Nintendo one, especially if we're talking about looking like the river of it in the background than it is in the arcade version. And of course, also in the arcade, we have much more color and a smoother transition of colors, sort of more of a gradient effect like on the Mortal Kombat logo that we see on the wall in the background, and that Mortal Kombat logo is also considerably larger Once again, on the SNES, it does have quite a dithered appearance here. And while I have complained about dithering on this version a lot, I will readily admit that the dithering is much worse in the Genesis version this time around. I would say the controls in the arcade one, definitely a little more responsive. I did use the same controller for both when playing these, to eliminate that as a possible issue for discrepancies. So the Pit 2 here looks pretty nice on Super Nintendo. Again, it's quite a bit darker than the arcade original. And it really, really stands out here. Now, I do like, again, the slightly brighter palette in the arcade version for these few stages we've talked about it on so far. A lot of older arcade games were brighter and just had weird contrast. Mortal Kombat II was not one of those. It is brighter, but it still looked good. It didn't look washed out or anything, you know, on its arcade CRT. As a quick aside here, Sub-Zero was always my main guy in Mortal Kombat 1, and for the first few playthroughs I did of Mortal Kombat 2. He's still one of my favorite characters to play as in this game. I love his moveset in this one, I like his regular Ice Blast, I like his ice on the ground that makes characters slip like idiots while you roundhouse kick them or uppercut them if they're close enough. I just decided to do this playthrough as Kitana this time, because I really enjoy her fatality and it's my favorite one in the game. So goodbye, Sub-Zero. Maybe I'll play as you next time.
Fatality.
We'll pause the Super Nintendo version here while I enter my name, and we're up to Melina. So here's another background where we've got some pretty noticeable differences, and it's kind of surprising when you consider just how simple this background is. So on the SNES version over there, you know, on the right, you can see the little wizard guys just remain completely still, while in the arcade version they bob up and down, at least the ones that are closer to the foreground. So the background ones animate, but they don't move in the arcade. On the Super Nintendo, the foreground ones do not bob up or down. And we can also see some pretty hefty dithering in the swirl in the background on the Super Nintendo. That is not really present in the arcade version, where a lot of the color transitions are a lot smoother. So, I mean, the arcade version can show way more colors on screen, so it's not surprising that they had to do some cutbacks on Super Nintendo. And there goes our evil clone.
Fatality. Fatality.
Alright, here we are in Shao Kahn's arena, where Shao Kahn sits and watches on as we do battle with Reptile. I do love that how even though Sonya and Kano are not in this game as playable characters, we do see them in the background here. They are both up in chains. Kano is on the left side of the screen, which you can see right now in both versions. Sonya's on the right. We'll get a look at her, at least on the Super Nintendo version, a little bit here. We'll see more of her when we see this background again later on in the game. So for this background, we see pretty big difference in colors. Once again, it's a lot darker on the Super Nintendo. We see Shao Kahn himself looks quite a bit smaller. He is pretty much proportional with our characters at least, so there's that. And we're going to be done with this background pretty quickly. The arcade version here, I am going to take a little bit longer to take out Reptile. Yeah, I had a much harder time taking out Reptile in the arcade version. I wasn't even sure I was going to win here. It gets pretty touch and go, which you'll see in just a moment. But spoiler alert, I am going to win. And pretty soon, Reptile is going to get very large and explode all over the place. One other thing I hadn't talked about yet that I will bring up now is the UI. So in the arcade version, we see the character names inside the energy bars, while in the Super Nintendo, they move them below the energy bars. In the UI, in the arcade version, it says push start for the second player to join the game, while on the Super Nintendo, it says press start. And then finally, when you win a round in the arcade version, you get the little Mortal Kombat logos, while on the Super Nintendo, instead you just get little round dots. Next up, everyone's favorite actor, Johnny Cage. And we are back in the pool area, so we've seen all the normal backgrounds now. So Johnny Cage looks a little bit better. I feel like he's, you know, the one character we can really see some face detail on in the Super Nintendo version. It's not great detail, especially when compared to the arcade original, but you can make some things out. You can see his default colors are a bit different on SNES, where he's got sort of the red shin guards instead of the blue or purple ones like the arcade. Remember, again, I am a bit colorblind, so I'm not sure if those are blue or purple. And as you go along, especially as you keep winning fights, there are times the AI will just get nuts. It'll walk up to you and just throw you. It'll basically act like it's reading your mind. So anytime you press a button or do an action, it is completely ready to counter it or avoid whatever you're doing. And once you get into one of those loops, it is really, really hard to win. It's not impossible, because I did do it on these. Like I said, I did use save states, so when I hit those weird situations, I would just, reload until I could win. Again, the point is not to say, hey, look at me, I'm so great, I beat this game without losing a round. No, it was just so I could show you everything compared here at the same time with the same characters on the same stages. Now, I do feel like on the Super Nintendo version here, our ninja characters, basically Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Reptile, they do suffer a bit. You don't really get the same texture on their outfits as the arcade original, where you can see, sort of that clearly, indicated checkerboard pattern. Instead, we have just sort of a dithered mishmash suggestion of it, in the Super Nintendo version. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm trashing this, because this was a great version of the game to play back when it was new. So everybody I knew of, that I played games with, was really happy with the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat 2. We're all very happy with the Genesis version also, which, like I said, is very good, even though I would say this version tops it. Unlike the first Mortal Kombat. And that was important, because while there were a lot of people like me who probably played the game on both platforms back in the day, there weren't a lot that owned it on both platforms. Usually you bought one, and then played the other one at a friend's house. And sales were definitely better on the Super Nintendo for the second game in the series. Alright, and here we are at Shang Tsung. And allow me a little song, if you would. Everybody have fun tonight. Everybody Shang Tsung tonight. I don't know why, I've always thought that every time I've seen Shang Tsung, way back since Mortal Kombat 1. So aside from my singing ability, or lack thereof, let's talk a little bit about this fight. On the cartridge versions like this, nice and fast, Shang Tsung can morph into any of the other characters, he has their moves when he morphs, and it can be pretty tricky playing against him if you're playing against another human. The computer here, at least on this level of difficulty, doesn't usually do a lot of transformations, and it only did a couple of them, in each version during the 2 rounds of my fight with him. After you defeat him and you get the opportunity to do a fatality, you will do the fatality on whichever character Shang Tsung happens to be in the form of at that time. So that's why you see I blow up regular Shang Tsung on the Super Nintendo and Baraka on the arcade version. I also still find it kinda hilarious just how many more body parts explode out of your opponent in the arcade version versus the Super Nintendo version. Hey, notice on the mountain, there's a big gap between Kintaro and Shao Kahn in the arcade, and just a tiny gap between Kintaro and Shao Kahn on the Super Nintendo? So Kintaro, wow, this fight is the one that is the most different between the 2 versions. I think a lot of it has to do with his proportional size, especially. So in the arcade one, you will see every time I do anything to him, I'm able to hit him in the air, basically, and then throw the fan and nail him right after. On the Super Nintendo, much, much harder to do that. With kicks, I found it next to impossible, even though it's not. I mean, you could do it, but your timing has to be really, really spot on. But in the arcade version, it's really easy to do. So this fight just feels very, very different between the 2 versions of the game. It's way harder on Super Nintendo. See, in the arcade, he falls for the old levitation move pretty much every single time.
Round 2. Fight.
And as you can see, I defeated Kintaro in round 1 of the arcade version much more quickly than I did in the Super Nintendo one. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, Using Katana in the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 2 feels like easy mode when you're up against these last two bosses, and while the same is true of Shao Kahn in both versions, it's not true of this Kintaro fight. Kintaro, just dramatically harder. He throws a lot more fireballs on the Super Nintendo 1 for some reason, he just dodges more of your moves, he comes at you a little more aggressively, and he just, throws you around more often. You'll especially see on the Super Nintendo version here, he tries to do that stomp move quite a lot more often than he does in the arcade one. And then after you persevere and finally win, you don't even get the chance to do a fatality. What a ripoff.
Kitana wins.
Alright, and here we are. Shao Kahn, our final boss.
Prepare to die.
Again, noticeably smaller on SNES. So as we come to a close during our final battle here, I just want to stress again that I think the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat 2 was really well done, and is a true redemption story for Sculptured Software. Sculptured's version of the first Mortal Kombat for the Super Nintendo was kind of a disaster. This time around, they've produced something that was vastly superior to what they had done the first time, and it is a much more playable game, it's a much more fun game, and it's one that, fans were much happier with. When we finish off Shao Kahn here, there's going to be a pretty big difference between the two versions. I'll point it out when we get there, which will be in just a moment or so. And I'll kind of prep you for it now. When you defeat Shao Kahn, watch the arcade version, watch what happens. I got them both at the same time. First, we have a much longer scream in the arcade version, but then it flips through a whole bunch of backgrounds super quick. On the SNES version, we have those black pauses between each background as we shuffle between them, and it takes much longer to go through them, before Shao Kahn finally explodes into rocks. So, kind of weird at how much longer it takes on the Super Nintendo for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just loading and unloading stuff from RAM. And then for the ending portraits and stuff themselves, the pictures that they use, you can see, huge in the arcade, teeny tiny, postage stamp sized on SNES. Now the pictures are there, so I applaud them for including them. And it's great that they're part of it. I mean, with the cartridge size limitations they had on this game, it's great that they squeezed so many things into it. But definitely different. Speaking of different, as we see our cast of characters here, in the arcade, we get the actor names along with the character names. And again, we can see Raiden spelled different between the arcade and SNES version. I don't know why they eliminated the actor names from this on Super Nintendo. It would have been nice to include them there. Notice that Shang Tsung doesn't laugh on the SNES version when he comes down for his little bow. But pretty much all the other characters do the same thing in both versions. We just lose the Shang Tsung laugh. And then the rest of our time here is going to be devoted to just going through these credits. So while we're doing this, I'll talk a little bit more just about some things, in general about the game. So Mortal Kombat 2, Sculptured Software really did fix basically every problem that existed in their port of Mortal Kombat 1 for the Super Nintendo. The controls are so much better. It's a much more fun game to play this time around. You don't feel like you're basically in molasses as you're trying to move your characters around and do special moves and stuff. They just work like they're supposed to most of the time. I feel like they're still not quite as easy to pull off as they are in the arcade or even on the Genesis versions of the game. But they're so much better that I don't consider it a huge issue between the Genesis and Super Nintendo like it was with the first game. Again, that sound and music definitely improved for Mortal Kombat 2 on Super Nintendo, but still not great. There's still a weird, I don't know, I guess I would call it a weedy quality to it, where it's a little bit tinny and the samples just aren't very good for a lot of things. A lot of the voices sound good. They're not crystal clear, but they sound good. And including all the fatalities, obviously was a wise decision. It's really kind of funny if you consider the time frame in which this game came out. Nintendo had been basically dragging Sega for having violent games on their systems, and talked about how, they were never going to have violent games like that on their family Super Nintendo system. Meanwhile, after the fairly dismal sales of the first Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo compared to Genesis, they went full bore and allowed all that violence from the arcade version into the Super Nintendo version of the game. So yes, Nintendo was being incredibly hypocritical. But the one thing I'll say, I love a lot of their hardware. I love a lot of their games. They are, the best really true game company still around from the early days of video game hardware. But man, are they hypocrites, and they are not consumer friendly. Okay, so there we go, a complete playthrough of the arcade and Super Nintendo versions of Mortal Kombat II. What did we learn today? Well, if you haven't played either version in a while, you may have memory holed the graphical differences between the two versions. The game is still well done on SNES, but there's a pretty big gulf in graphical quality between the two games, especially when it comes to colors, animation, and the size of the characters. The loss in detail along with the size of the characters is readily apparent. It's tough to make out any faces on the lower res SNES game with its teeny tiny little characters. Still, there's no doubt about it. MK2 on SNES was a well-done conversion, and it redeemed Sculptured Software after their very lackluster port of the first Mortal Kombat on SNES. The music in particular could have still been better, but on the whole, I don't know anyone who was unhappy with SNES MK2 back when it was new. I do have a few quibbles with it, especially with some move timing and collision modifications due to the changes in character sizes, but overall, this was a fantastic way to play MK2 at home way back in 1994. And the Genesis version is also really well done this time around, and I'd say it handles a little better than the SNES one as far as controls and timing go, but it does look and sound worse. I might show you that one and some others in a future video down the road sometime. So tell me, what did you think of the SNES version of Mortal Kombat 2 back when it was new? Or are you just seeing it for the first time today? Which version do you prefer, Genesis or SNES? Or did you prefer the later releases on platforms like the 32X or Saturn? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll see every video as soon as I release it. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.